What happens to the mirror when the reflection is gone? The most profitable product of the American inner city is not narcotics, nor is it the culture that the world so voraciously consumes. It is attrition. In the United States, the specialized industry of the ghetto functions on a cycle of managed loss, a system where the human cost is not a byproduct but the primary fuel. Every year, billions of dollars circulate through a pipeline that begins on a specific street corner in South Central or Compton and ends in the ledger of a private prison corporation or a high-end arms manufacturer. But this engine requires a spark. It requires a conflict so deeply entrenched that it becomes a biological necessity for the environment. We often view the rivalry between the Bloods and the Crips as a tragic mistake of history, a chaotic explosion of neighborhood violence. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. The rivalry is not a glitch. It is the operating system. It is a symmetrical architecture where two opposing forces provide each other with the one thing they need most to justify their existence: a reason to remain armed. If the war between the red and the blue were to end tomorrow, the entire economic justification for the American bloc would collapse, leaving a vacuum that the state is not prepared to fill. This is the investigation of a symbiotic tragedy, a look at how two of the most notorious organizations in American history are not actually enemies, but two halves of the same mirror. To understand the present, we must look at the mechanics of the origin. In the late 1960s, the dissolution of centralized political movements in Los Angeles left a power vacuum. Into this void stepped the Crips, originally envisioned as a protective collective, but rapidly expanding into a dominant territorial force. By 1972, the sheer scale of the Crip expansion created an existential crisis for smaller, independent neighborhoods. On Piru Street in Compton, a group of young men realized that individual resistance was impossible. They formed an alliance with other non-Cripsets, adopting the color red to distinguish themselves from the blue tide. This is the core paradox of the Bloods. They are a reactionary entity. Their entire identity was forged as a negative space to the Crips' positive pressure. Without the Crip threat, the Bloods have no foundational logic. This created a binary system that mirrored the Cold War, a bipolar world where every neutral bloc was forced to choose a side, not out of ideological agreement, but for the sake of survival. The physical structure of these territories is governed by what sociologists call the drafting. In a standard American suburb, a zip code determines your school district or your property tax. In the heart of the conflict zones, a zip code is a military conscription. A 17-year-old boy living on a specific block of Rosecrans Avenue does not wake up and decide to join a movement based on a manifesto. He is drafted by the geography of his mother's apartment. If he walks 3 blocks east to buy a gallon of milk, he is perceived as an enemy combatant by one side. If he stays home, he is expected to contribute to the defense of his own perimeter. The choice is an illusion. The draft ensures a constant supply of high-risk labor for the illicit market. Because these young men are marked by their geography, they are effectively barred from the traditional labor market, making them dependent on the gang's internal economy. This is the first layer of the trap. The conflict creates the isolation, and the isolation creates the soldier. A young man named Marcus sits at a laminate table in a small apartment. He is 22, but his hands move with the stiff caution of a man much older. He is counting small, clear plastic bags. Outside, the sound of a heavy bass from a passing SUV vibrates the window pane. Marcus does not look up. He knows the frequency of every vehicle on this street. He knows which ones belong to the neighbors and which ones are foreign. He isn't a high-ranking member. He is an inventory manager for a small set. He spent 4 years in trade school trying to become an electrician, but the job sites were in territories he couldn't cross without a police escort he couldn't afford. The draft claimed him not through a handshake, but through the simple reality that he couldn't get to work without dying. Now, he processes the product that funds the ammunition that keeps the foreign cars from stopping in front of his mother's door. He is a cog in the war economy, a man working a job to pay for a war that he is only fighting so he can keep his job. This war economy is the most sophisticated element of the binary. To maintain a territorial edge, a set must possess superior firepower. A handgun that costs $500 on the legal market may cost $1,500 on the street, and a high-capacity rifle even more. To afford these tools of defense, the set must increase its output of narcotics. This creates a feedback loop of escalating stakes. The need for guns drives the need for drugs. The sale of drugs attracts law enforcement and rival incursions. The increased threat necessitates more guns. This is not a business in the traditional sense, because the profits are immediately reinvested into the mechanisms of attrition. Both the Bloods and the Crips are effectively working for the same third-party beneficiaries: the arms traffickers who supply the weapons and the industrial complexes that process the eventual prisoners. They are two competing sales forces for a product that destroys them both. We must also consider the non-players, the civilian population that lives within the mirror's frame. For a shop owner on Figueroa Street, the conflict is a tax. It is a constant negotiation with the local hierarchy for the right to exist. These individuals are the silent engineers of the neighborhood's survival, yet they are the most vulnerable to the system's managed attrition. When a drive-by occurs, the target is often a specific individual, but the consequence is a collective trauma that devalues the property, shutters the businesses, and ensures that no outside investment will ever reach the block. This lack of investment is crucial. If the neighborhood were to become prosperous, the gang's role as the primary employer and protector would vanish. Therefore, the conflict serves as a gatekeeper, keeping the community in a state of perpetual economic underdevelopment that makes the gang's presence mandatory. The rivalry provides a sense of order in a world that feels forgotten by the state. Within the Blood or Crip structure, there is a clear hierarchy, a promotion track, and a set of laws. For a young man who has grown up in a fractured home in a neighborhood where the police are viewed as an occupying force rather than a service, the gang provides the only legible social contract available. The tragedy is that this contract is a suicide pact. The senior leadership, those few who survive into their 40s, often recognize the symmetry. They see that their counterparts across the color line are dealing with the same trauma, the same supply chain issues, and the same mounting body counts. But the system is designed to prevent de-escalation. If a leader attempts to broker a lasting peace, he risks losing the war economy that justifies his taxes on the younger members. Peace is an economic threat to the internal structure of the block. Consider the grandmother, Mrs. Wallace, who has lived in the same bungalow since 1974. She keeps her curtains drawn even on the sunniest days. She has learned to distinguish the sound of a firecracker from a 9mm round by the way the air displaces. She is not a member of any set, yet her life is dictated by the azure and crimson binary. She pays a young man $10 to mow her lawn, not because he is a gardener, but because his presence on her grass acts as a temporary pass for her home. She is a non-player who has been forced to learn the rules of a game she never asked to play. Her existence is a testament to the collateral lens. She is the person the system is supposedly protecting, yet she is a prisoner in her own living room. The block exists as a fortress for the gang, but for Mrs. Wallace, it is a cage maintained by the very people who claim to represent her neighborhood's pride. The unifying theory of the American street is that the conflict is a self-sustaining ecosystem. It is a perpetual motion machine of grief and capital. The Bloods and the Crips are not fighting for a final victory. They are fighting for the continuation of the struggle. A final victory would mean the end of the draft, the end of the war economy, and the end of the identity that provides meaning to thousands of lives. They are trapped in a mirror, swinging at a reflection that swings back with equal force. The binary of red and blue is a distraction from the reality that both sides are being consumed by the same engine. It is a managed attrition that serves everyone except the people living on the block. The cycle is nearly impossible to break because it has become the foundation of the local reality. To stop the war is to ask the neighborhood to reinvent itself from nothing, in a world that has already decided it prefers the neighborhood exactly as it is, divided, armed, and profitable. The harsh reality of this managed attrition is most visible in the transition from the streets to the state-sanctioned facilities of the Department of Corrections. We must analyze the prison system not as a deterrent, but as a finishing school for the binary. When a member of a Crip set or a Blood alliance is processed into the California or federal prison system, the mirror does not shatter, it magnifies. In the vacuum of a prison yard, the external conflict is distilled into its purest form. Here, the draft is no longer geographical, it is biological and historical. The state utilizes these pre-existing animosities to maintain a balance of power within the facilities. If the inmate population were a monolith, they would represent a unified threat to the administration. By maintaining the red and blue binary behind bars, the system ensures that the primary focus of the incarcerated remains on each other, rather than the conditions of their confinement. This is the ultimate efficiency of the mirror. It provides the state with a self-policing population. This leads us to the investigation of the incarceration economy. Every individual removed from the street and placed into a cell represents a shift in capital. The cost of housing an inmate, often exceeding $80,000 a year in some jurisdictions, is a transfer of public tax dollars into the hands of service providers, medical contractors, and correctional unions. For the block, the loss of a young man to a 20-year sentence is a tragedy. For the industry surrounding the prison, it is a 20-year annuity. The conflict ensures that the yield remains high. Because the war economy on the street necessitates crime for survival, the pipeline is never empty. The Bloods and the Crips are, in effect, the recruiters for a labor force that works for pennies an hour manufacturing office furniture or fighting wildfires, all while the primary beneficiaries of this labor reside in boardrooms far removed from the sound of gunfire. In a sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of a high-security facility, a man named Terrence walks with his hands behind his back. He is 48 years old. He has spent 26 of those years as a resident of the state. On the street, he was a strategist for a set in Inglewood. Here, his role is more nuanced. He sits on a concrete bench across from a man who, 30 years ago, would have been his target. They speak in low tones about the peace treaties that never seem to take hold on the outside. Terrence understands the mechanics now. He sees how their mutual hatred has been the most effective tool used against them. He watches the younger men arrive, the new drafts, full of the same adrenaline and color loyalty he once possessed. He tries to explain the mirror to them, but the binary is too loud. To the young men, Terrence is a relic. To the system, Terrence is a stable line item in a budget. He is the personification of the managed attrition, a human being who has been successfully harvested and processed by the engine of the streets. The third block of our investigation explores the branding of dehumanization. The use of red and blue, the modification of language, such as replacing the letter C with a B or vice versa, is more than just a tribal marker. It is a linguistic tool that facilitates the violence necessary for the system to function. By altering the way they speak and dress, the players create a theatrical distance between themselves and their rivals. It is far easier to pull a trigger on a reflection or a symbol than it is on a neighbor. This branding is what allows the war to persist across generations. It turns a human being into a representative of an abstract concept. When the media and the public see red versus blue, they see a sporting event with lethal stakes, which further isolates the community from genuine empathy or systemic intervention. The branding makes the violence legible to the outside world in a way that allows them to dismiss it as a choice rather than a systemic failure. This brings us to the consequence of the binary, the economic justification for the block. We must ask what happens if the conflict actually ends. In the rare moments of genuine peace, such as the 1992 What's Truce, the sudden cessation of violence revealed a terrifying truth. Without the war, the poverty of the neighborhood was no longer justified by the chaos. When the guns went silent, the lack of grocery stores, the failing schools, and the absence of social services became glaringly obvious. The war acts as a smokescreen for municipal neglect. As long as the Bloods and Crips are the lead story, the state does not have to answer for why the infrastructure of South Central looks like a developing nation. The conflict provides a convenient excuse for the bloc's continued state of decay. If the war ended, the demand for radical economic restructuring would be undeniable. Therefore, the maintenance of the rivalry is paradoxically a form of political stability for the status quo. Consider the perspective of Angela, a 34-year-old mother of 3 who runs a small daycare out of her apartment. She is the epitome of the non-player. To her, The red and blue are not mirrors. They are weather patterns. She knows that when the temperature rises, the frequency of the draft increases. She spends her days teaching toddlers to stay away from the windows when they hear a loud pop. Her business is not illicit, yet she is subject to the same war economy as the dealers. She pays a safety tax in the form of inflated prices at the only grocery store she can safely reach. She is the collateral that the system refuses to count. For Angela, the consequence of the war is a permanent state of hypervigilance that has physically altered her nervous system. She represents the millions of non-players whose lives are the interest paid on the debt of the street's binary. The unifying theory of the American street suggests that the cycle is nearly impossible to break because the exit costs are too high. To leave the binary, an individual must not only renounce their set but also their entire social safety net, their protection, and their identity. In an environment where the state has abdicated its role as a provider of security, the gang is the only insurer of last resort. To quit is to become an uninsured entity in a high-risk zone. Furthermore, the sunk cost fallacy plays a devastating role. When a set has lost dozens of members to the mirror, peace is viewed as a betrayal of the dead. The blood already spilled becomes the primary argument for spilling more. This creates a closed-loop logic where the only way to honor the past is to destroy the future. The American bloc is not a failed society. It is a highly successful, albeit brutal, economic zone designed for the extraction of human potential. The Bloods and the Crips are the involuntary managers of this extraction. They are the mirror images of a society that decided it was cheaper to manage attrition than to invest in equity. The binary of the crimson and the azure is the theater of the street, a performance that keeps the participants focused on each other while the stagehands collect the ticket sales. The rivalry is the fuel, the body count is the exhaust, and the profit is siphoned away to places where the colors red and blue only exist on a stock ticker or a political map. As we look at the streets of Los Angeles, Chicago, or any American city where this binary has taken root, we must realize that we are looking at a reflection of our own national priorities. We have built a system where the bloc is a necessity, where the war is a livelihood, and where the mirror is the only thing the people are allowed to see. The tragedy of the Bloods and the Crips is not that they are enemies, but that they are the same people, fighting the same ghost, for the benefit of a world that only watches them through the safety of a screen. The cycle continues because we have made it profitable for it to do so. Until the economic justification for the bloc is dismantled, until the war economy is replaced by a peace economy that offers more than the draft, the mirror will remain intact. The crimson and the azure will continue their dance, and the attrition will continue to be managed. The question is not when the war will end, but who we would be if we no longer had the war to define the other. If you found this investigation into the systemic mechanics of the American street intellectually stimulating, consider supporting the continued documentation of these hidden histories by engaging with this channel. The logistics of the binary extend far beyond the borders of the neighborhood. We must investigate the supply chain of attrition. The weaponry used to sustain the conflict is not manufactured within the ghetto. It is an import. In a nation with more firearms than citizens, the bloc serves as a high-velocity sink for the secondary gun market. The iron pipeline, the flow of firearms from states with lax regulations to urban centers with strict ones, is a vital artery for the war. A semi-automatic rifle purchased legally at a gun show in a neighboring state is trafficked into the city, where its value triples instantly. This price hike is the risk premium of the illicit market. The Bloods and the Crips do not just fight with these tools. They are the end consumers in a multi-billion-dollar domestic arms industry that officially condemns them while unofficially profiting from their constant need for security. This is the supply side of the mirror. For every young man who falls on the sidewalk, a manufacturer, a distributor, and a trafficker have already realized their profit. The drug trade functions with the same cold efficiency of a global logistics firm. The street-level set is merely the last mile of a chain that spans continents. While the public focuses on the kingpin or the pusher, the sociological reality is that the gang is a franchised retail operation. They take the highest risk for the lowest margin. When a shipment of narcotics reaches a Crip-controlled territory in the west side or a Blood-controlled pocket in the east, it is broken down into units for individual consumption. The war economy dictates the price. If a territory is hot due to an active shooting cycle, the price of the product rises to cover the increased cost of protection and the risk of police interference. The consumer, often a non-resident who travels into the neighborhood from the affluent suburbs, is the silent financier of the conflict. Their demand provides the liquidity that allows the sets to purchase the very ammunition used to defend the territory they are visiting. It is a closed-loop financial system where the players are the only ones paying the price in blood, while the capital exits the community as quickly as it enters. A woman named Elena stands behind the bulletproof glass of a corner market. It is 11:15 p.m. She has owned the store for 15 years. She does not look at the faces of the young men who come in to buy rolling papers or alkaline water. She looks at their hands and their waistbands. Elena is an expert in the symmetry of tension. She knows that if a group of young men in blue enters, she must ensure no one in red is already in the aisles. She acts as a freelance air traffic controller for human conflict. She has no allegiance to either side, but she is the one who sweeps the glass from the sidewalk after a dispute over the supply chain. She represents the non-player as a logistics coordinator. Her store is a neutral port in a sea of privateers, and her survival depends on her ability to read the minute shifts in the war economy before the first shot is fired. She is part of the architecture of the block, a witness to the managed attrition who has learned that in the mirror, there is no such thing as an innocent bystander, only a target that hasn't been identified yet. We must then examine the architecture of containment. The physical environment of the American ghetto is designed to facilitate surveillance and limit mobility. This is geospatial attrition. The installation of ShotSpotter technology, acoustic sensors designed to triangulate gunfire, creates a digital net over the neighborhood. While marketed as a public safety tool, it functions as a data collection mechanism that justifies the constant presence of tactical units. The block becomes a laboratory for urban policing. The Crips and Bloods provide the active variables for this experiment. When a police helicopter circles overhead for hours, its primary purpose is not necessarily to catch a suspect, but to exert a psychological pressure that reinforces the boundaries of the territory. The noise, the lights, and the checkpoints remind the residents that they are living in a special economic zone, where the constitutional protections of the outside world are suspended in favor of containment. This containment is supported by the digital mirror. In the modern era, the conflict has migrated to social media platforms. The binary of red and blue is now a clout economy. A young man in a housing project in Watts can broadcast a provocation to a rival set in real time. This digital escalation bypasses the traditional oversight of the few remaining older heads who might have once de-escalated a situation. The algorithms of these platforms, designed to maximize engagement through conflict, prioritize these provocations, pushing them to the top of the feed for both friends and enemies. The digital mirror ensures that the war is never off-duty. A slight on a live stream becomes a death sentence on the street within hours. The tech companies, based in glass towers hundreds of miles away, benefit from the engagement generated by the violence, while the block suffers the physical consequences. This is the newest layer of the war economy, the commodification of street-level trauma for the sake of ad revenue. The investigation now turns to the inheritance of the debt. In the binary system, trauma is a multi-generational asset. A 10-year-old boy growing up in a Crip-affiliated household does not start with a clean slate. He inherits the debts of his father, his uncles, and his older brothers. If his father was killed by a rival set, that boy is born with a deficit of honor that the system expects him to repay. This is the biological draft. The conflict is not just a choice, it is a family legacy. To refuse the call is to dishonor the memory of the dead. This emotional manipulation is what keeps the mirror from shattering. The Bloods and the Crips have created a form of ancestral warfare where the original grievances, often dating back to the early 1970s, are no longer relevant, yet the obligation to fight remains. The debt is never settled. It is merely refinanced with new lives. A 14-year-old boy, whom we will call the Junior, stands on a street corner holding a burner phone. He is not selling drugs. He is a lookout. His job is to watch for the specific unmarked sedans used by the gang unit. He is paid $50 a day, which is more than his mother makes in 4 hours at her retail job. He is a drafted laborer in the war economy. He sees the older members not as criminals, but as the only successful men in his immediate vicinity. They have the cars, the clothes, and the respect that the legitimate world denies his demographic. To him, the binary is not a tragedy. It is a career path. He has already been taught that the Azure are his brothers and the Crimson are the reason his neighborhood is a fortress. The Junior is the future of the managed attrition, a fresh unit of labor entering the pipeline. He doesn't know that he is a line item in a prison budget for the year 2035. The legal infrastructure of the binary is the final mechanism of control. Conspiracy statutes and sentencing enhancements for gang-related crimes create a legal trapdoor. In many jurisdictions, a young man can be charged with the crimes of his associates simply by being seen in their presence. This guilt by geography ensures that once a person is identified as part of the binary, their path to the incarceration economy is virtually guaranteed. The state uses the rivalry as a shortcut for prosecution. Rather than investigating the complex sociological roots of a crime, they simply apply a gang label, which triggers mandatory minimum sentences and removes the individual from the community for decades. This managed extraction of the male population is a key component of the ghetto's economic structure. It leaves behind a community of women, children, and the elderly, who are then even more dependent on the state or the gang for survival. The unifying theory concludes that the red and blue mirror is a masterpiece of social engineering. It is a system that allows for the maximum extraction of wealth and labor with the minimum amount of external investment. By keeping the conflict focused on the binary, the neighbor against the neighbor, the block against the block, the larger structural issues of American inequality remain unaddressed. The Bloods and the Crips are the internal security for a system that wants the ghetto to remain exactly where it is. They provide the violence that justifies the policing, the prisoners that justify the jails, and the trauma that justifies the neglect. They are the twin engines of a machine that turns poverty into profit. The tragedy of the block is not a lack of order, but an abundance of it. It is an order based on the managed attrition of human life. It is a world where the mirror is the only reality, and where the reflection is always an enemy. As we look at the history of the Bloods and the Crips, we are not looking at a gang war. We are looking at a mirror of the American soul, a reflection of a society that has decided that some lives are only valuable as fuel for the engine of the street. The cycle will remain unbroken as long as the mirror is the only thing we allow the block to see. To shatter the mirror is to see the human being on the other side, and to recognize that their struggle is our own. Until then, the Crimson and the Azure will continue to reflect each other in a dance of death that serves everyone but the dancers. If you are compelled by this deep dive into the systemic architecture of our cities, please subscribe to Tales from the Block to ensure these investigations continue to reach those who need to see beyond the mirror. The geography of this binary is not accidental. It is a product of deliberate urban engineering. To understand why the Bloods and Crips have remained confined to specific corridors for over half a century, we must investigate the concrete borders of the American city. In the mid-20th century, the construction of the massive freeway systems in Los Angeles, the 105, the 110, and the 710, did more than just facilitate suburban commutes. These monolithic structures of rebar and asphalt were strategically placed to act as physical barricades, severing established black communities and creating pockets of isolation. These are the natural kill zones of the ghetto. By cutting off foot traffic and limiting access to only a few overpasses and underpasses, the city planners essentially built the arenas in which the red and blue binary would eventually play out. These freeways are the walls of the modern Coliseum, ensuring that the conflict remains internal, visible to the passing motorist only as a blur of graffiti, but never escaping into the more affluent sectors of the city. This geographic determinism creates a hyperconcentration of trauma. Because the residents are physically hemmed in by infrastructure, They cannot escape the acoustic footprint of the war. We must analyze the neurobiology of the block. In a standard environment, the human brain's fight or flight response is a temporary state triggered by an immediate threat. In the heart of the conflict zones, this state becomes permanent. This is chronic cortisol attrition. When a child grows up hearing police sirens, helicopters, and the sharp report of gunfire as a daily background noise, their amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes chronically enlarged. Their prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, is effectively suppressed. This is not a choice. It is a physiological adaptation to an environment of managed attrition. The mirror is not just a social construct. It is a neurological one. By the time a drafted youth reaches the age of 16, his brain has been physically rewired to prioritize immediate survival over long-term consequence, making him the perfect soldier for a war that requires no strategy beyond the next 5 minutes. A woman named Sarah stands in a classroom in a primary school 3 blocks from the Imperial Courts housing project. She is 28, an idealistic educator who arrived 2 years ago. Today, she is not teaching multiplication. She is conducting a safety drill. She watches as 25 7-year-olds instinctively drop to the floor and crawl toward the interior wall, away from the windows. They do this with a practiced, eerie silence. There is no crying. Crying is a luxury their environment has already stripped away. Sarah realizes that she is not preparing them for a rare event. She is training them to accept the mirror as their ceiling. One of her students, a boy with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, looks up and asks if the blue men or the red men are coming today. He asks it with the same casual tone another child might use to ask about the weather. Sarah feels the weight of the managed attrition in that question. She is witnessing the draft in its embryonic stage, the moment where the binary stops being an external threat and becomes an internal truth. The investigation now pivots to the healthcare attrition. The trauma centers of the inner city are the repair shops of the binary. In these hospitals, the war economy meets the medical-industrial complex. A single gunshot wound can result in hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical billing, much of it subsidized by public funds. The surgeons who work these shifts become some of the most skilled trauma specialists in the world, often training military doctors before they deploy to foreign war zones. The block provides the live tissue training for the nation's medical elite. This is the dark irony of the system. The violence of the Bloods and Crips is used to refine the life-saving techniques that will be used on valuable citizens elsewhere. The victim of a drive-by on Vermont Avenue is a data point in a medical journal, a vessel for a surgical breakthrough, and a source of revenue for a hospital system that provides almost no preventative care to his neighborhood. We must also analyze the political utility of the binary. For the municipal politician, the Bloods versus Crips conflict is a renewable resource. During election cycles, the Crimson and Azure are invoked to stoke fear and justify tough-on-crime platforms. This rhetoric allows for the redirection of billions of dollars away from social safety nets and into the expansion of the police state. The gang database, a list of thousands of individuals, many of whom have never committed a violent crime, becomes a tool for political posturing. By labeling a neighborhood as high-intensity gang territory, the state can justify no-knock warrants, civil asset forfeiture, and the suspension of the Fourth Amendment. The binary provides the moral cover for the erosion of civil liberties. If the war ended, the politician would lose their most effective boogeyman, and the taxpayer might start asking why the schools are still crumbling despite the record-breaking police budgets. The cultural extraction of the binary is perhaps its most visible global export. The aesthetic of the Bloods and Crips, the bandanas, the hand signs, the specific cadence of speech, has been commodified by the global entertainment industry. This is vampiric capitalism. Large corporations, record labels, and fashion houses strip the mirror of its blood and trauma, repackaging it as authentic urban culture for consumption in the suburbs of Ohio, the clubs of Tokyo, and the high-fashion runways of Paris. The players on the block are the uncredited content creators for a multi-billion-dollar ghetto chic industry. While a young man in Compton is arrested for wearing the wrong color, a teenager in a gated community wears the same color as a fashion statement. The profit from this aesthetic never returns to the block. It is siphoned into the accounts of executives who have never stepped foot on Piru Street. The culture of the war is harvested, while the people who live it are discarded. In a glass-walled office in Beverly Hills, a marketing executive named Julian looks at a mood board for a new streetwear campaign. The board is covered in images of chain-link fences, distressed concrete, and primary color accents, red and blue. Julian talks about edge and street cred and capturing the energy of the struggle. He has never seen the inside of a trauma unit. He has never felt the vibration of a police helicopter in his chest. To him, the mirror is a color palette. He is the ultimate non-player, a man who makes a six-figure salary by translating the managed attrition of the ghetto into a lifestyle brand. He is part of the machinery that ensures the binary remains cool enough to stay profitable, but dangerous enough to remain contained. He is the economic parasite of the conflict, feeding on the reflection while the original burns. This leads to the gentrification paradox. We often view the violence of the Bloods and Crips as an obstacle to real estate development, but for the savvy investor, the war is a holding pattern. The constant threat of violence keeps property values in the inner city artificially low. It prevents the local residents from building equity and keeps the block in a state of economic stasis. However, the land itself, often located near downtown hubs or transit corridors, remains incredibly valuable. The conflict acts as a deterrent that keeps the land cheap until the city is ready to reclaim it. When the time is right, the state increases policing to a level of total saturation, effectively cleaning the area of the binary to make way for luxury condos and tech hubs. The drafted soldiers who fought for that territory are not given a share of the new development. They are simply pushed into the next pocket of isolation, where the mirror is reset and the cycle begins again. The war is the discount rate for the future city. The unifying theory of the American street is that the red and blue binary is the most successful public-private partnership in history. It is a system where the public provides the human capital through the draft, and the private sector extracts the profit through the war economy, the incarceration economy, and the cultural industry. The Bloods and the Crips are not rebels. They are the involuntary labor that keeps this partnership functional. They are the managers of their own demise, tasked with the impossible job of maintaining an identity in a world that has already commodified their extinction. The cycle is nearly impossible to break because the infrastructure of peace does not exist. There is no multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to the reconciliation of the mirror. There are no conflict mediators with the same budget as a SWAT team. There are no peace trusts that offer the same immediate signing bonus as a street-level set. The system is heavily weighted toward the continuation of the war because the war is productive in the language of capital. Peace, in the context of the American ghetto, is unproductive. It doesn't fill prison beds, it doesn't sell ammunition, it doesn't justify police budgets, and it doesn't provide edgy content for the media. As we stand on the corner of a street that has seen 3 generations of managed attrition, we must look past the crimson and the azure. We must see the mirror for what it is, a tool of division designed to prevent the block from looking upward. The Bloods and the Crips are 2 sides of the same coin, tossed by a hand they will never see into a game they can never win. The mirror ensures that when they look for the source of their pain, they only see each other. They see a reflection in a different color, and they strike at it, never realizing that the glass they are hitting is the only thing keeping them both in the dark. The final harsh reality is that the block is not a place. It is a function. It is a specialized zone of the American experiment where the rules of the free world are inverted to facilitate the managed attrition of a specific population. The Bloods and the Crips are the functionaries of this zone. They are the guardians of a prison with no roof. Until we address the economic, neurological, and geographic foundations of this mirror, the dance will continue. The draft will call the next generation, the war economy will fund the next shooting, and the incarceration economy will process the next body. The story of the Bloods and the Crips is the story of a nation that found a way to turn its most profound social failures into its most consistent economic successes. It is a story of a binary that was never meant to be solved, only managed. As the sun sets over the concrete borders of the city, the lights of the police helicopters begin their nightly patrol, casting long, sweeping shadows over the blocks. In those shadows, the Crimson and the Azure prepare for another night of the war. They do not do this because they want to, but because the mirror tells them they have no other choice. If you have stayed with us through this 7,000-word investigation into the mechanics of attrition, you are now part of a small group that chooses to see the system behind the struggle. To support the continued documentation of the tales from the block, please consider subscribing and sharing this investigation with those who are ready to look past the reflection.